Welcome class to today's lesson. Today, the topic that we will be discussing is power and conflict management issues in environmental communication and negotiation. So our second slide here actually outlines the various topics that we will be looking at briefly. You can take your time and go through them carefully. I will leave that up to you, but each of the topics that we look at will actually be addressed in this lesson, either in the lecture itself or in the activity that you will have to do related to this week's lesson. So the first thing we want to look at are the causes of conflict in organizations. So we would look at a number of issues that are fairly common in terms of being triggers to conflicts within any organization. So as we discuss, you want to keep in mind that think about how this is relevant in any environmental organization. So the first thing we want to address are task interdependencies. So where there is a great amount of interdependencies amongst individuals, in order to get a task completed, there is a greater risk of conflict since expectations, goals, and priorities may vary. So just imagine if you have a task to complete, and whether it is within your department or whether you have to depend on deliverables from another department in order for you to be able to complete your task, this can actually raise the risk or increase the risk of conflict, because each person may have a stack of tasks on their desk to complete, and each person is going to have their own ideas to what is important and what isn't. What's important to me may not be important to you, and this can have a cascading effect where different persons and different departments are dependent on each other. And this risk of conflict increases the more persons and the more departments that are involved in the completion of any one task. Second point, another cause, potential cause, status inconsistencies. So where you have higher ranking personnel like managers, oftentimes you find that they have privileges that the lower ranking personnel do not have. A common example of this would be where managers may have the privilege of taking time off during the week for personal reasons, while you find lower ranked employees do not. If oftentimes you find, let's say, for example, if it is a medical reason, you have a doctor's appointment, you may find that the managers may have the privilege where they can just take the extra hours off and they don't have to apply out of their leave, whereas lower ranking employees might be forced to take a day off out of their leave. All right, so this kind of inconsistency can be perceived as organizational unfairness that can also contribute to conflict, especially in circumstances like these. Additionally, we also have jurisdictional ambiguities that can lead to conflict within organizations. So for example, you may have conflicts that may result from situations where it is unclear exactly where responsibilities lie. An example of this, where if you have two departments that are involved in the hiring process, what happens when one department wants to hire somebody and the other one does not? For example, oftentimes you find that there might be an interview panel in the hiring process. You may find persons from HR on that panel. And let's say, for example, if it is the OSH department that wants to hire someone into their department, HR will be involved. You would also find someone from OSH on that panel. What happens if there is a disparity in terms of the perception from each department with regards to that interview candidate? Who has the final say? If there is no clear guidelines, if there are no clear guidelines or explanations as to who has the final say, then you can have conflict occurring right there, because there's no way forward. How do you move forward? Then we also have communication problems. This can facilitate conflict when the message is misunderstood or information is withheld. We discussed some of these issues with regards to problems in communication in previous lessons. So this kind of situation here now can result in a lot of frustration and anger amongst different parties. If there are problems in the efficiency of the communicating information, if you have situations where maybe technical jargon is being used for an audience that cannot understand it, if information is being filtered and purposely withheld, all these kinds of situations that we have discussed before, these can lead to problems and promote conflict between different parties and amongst different parties in your organization. Another point of conflict where you have dependence on common resource pools. So whenever several departments compete for scarce resources, conflict would arise. And as you can imagine, at this point in time where we are still dealing with the fallout, economic fallout of coronavirus and COVID-19 pandemic, where you find resources are now even more limited, there is increased risk of conflict. In these situations, as they say, someone always wins and someone always loses. And the reasons for that could be varied. For example, it may be that someone has, maybe by virtue of their position, they can wield that authority in order to get what they want. It may be that a person or a department has great influence within an organization, knows persons in authority, persons who can be persuaded to aid them. And sometimes there are a multitude of reasons, all right? But the point is, someone will always win and someone will always lose when it comes to competition for limited resources. Next point, lack of common performance standards. So where you have differences in performance criteria and reward systems that can contribute to conflict. For example, where you have levels of efficiency that may be defined differently for different departments, as in nature of the responsibilities of one department would be different from the other. So in terms of progress and performance, they define that differently. Where they are defined differently, then if you try to compare them, it is really an unfair situation to attempt to compare them, and that can lead to conflict. So we're talking about a situation of comparing apples and oranges. For example, how do we compare the performance of the finance department with that of the performance of, let's say, the marketing department? All right, now the goals and responsibilities of each one is different. So if they are different, how do you compare them? Therefore, if you want to compare, you must have some kind of standardized performance criteria in which you can use, and that can be applied across the board. So what we're saying is the absence of that standard performance criteria can cause conflict. Individual differences. So where you have differences in personal abilities, traits, and skills, this can lead to problems, and this can influence in nature of personal relationships. So we're talking about on a personal level now. So for example, you have individuals that will have different degrees of dominance, characteristics, aggressiveness, authoritarianism, tolerance for ambiguity. These can all lead to potential conflict. With regards to the issue of tolerance for ambiguity, if you recall one of the previous lessons, we talked about the differences between men and women. And if you recall, we said that women tend to like a lot of information and ask a lot of questions before getting into a project. In that sense, we can probably say that women don't like ambiguity. Women prefer to have as much information up front before getting into a project. So this can probably lead to conflict between men and women working on the same project. So again, individual differences, character traits, etc., can lead to conflict. Now we want to look at power and conflict in environmental organizations, right? So we're still talking about some of the issues of conflict and power in terms of authority, but now we're looking at it in the context of environmental organizations. So conflicts are caused by different opinions, interests, and needs that often make it difficult for people to work together. And we've seen some of that already. So these conflicts can be further exacerbated by a scarcity of resources within the organization, dependence on common resources and limited resources as well. Additionally, varying policy differences across organizations, which can lead to much stress, tension, hostility, and anxiety. So, for example, you may find one department may have its own policy from another department, and those policies will guide the operations of that particular department. But because priorities and goals may be different and they have not been aligned to the organizational goal, you find conflicts can happen between departments. Within the third point, within the organization, the inherent interdependencies increase the risk of conflict. Remember, we said the more interdependencies you have between departments or between individuals and persons, it increases the risk level of conflict. Inequitable distribution of tasks where one person has more work than another. This can also result in resentment and frustration. And this often happens in the workplace or in any organization. And unfortunately, what tends to be very common as well in these kind of scenarios is where you find employees who are very responsible and very productive. Oftentimes you find that they get most of the workload dumped on them. And that is very unfortunate. And that can lead to resentment and frustration on the part of those employees. Now you have a problem on your hands. These conflicts can endanger collaboration on projects. And you know, so the next point says, since collaboration is an integral process in environmental organizations, the risk of encroaching in jurisdictional domain is present and leads to conflict of authority. So this is why you find across the board, not only in environmental studies and management programs, but you find that we tend to integrate collaboration projects in every one of our courses, because once you have to work in any organization, you find that collaboration will be necessary. So you'll need to develop the skills to work with each other, figure out problem solving strategies for group conflict and group dynamics, etc. All right, so it's very difficult when you have all of these different conditions existing that increases the risk of conflict to actually be able to successfully achieve the goals of any collaborative project that you have. And often here, as this last portion of the point says, leads to conflict of authority. Oftentimes in these conflicts, you have, as we said, ambiguity in terms of who's in charge, who has the final say. There can also be religious conflict in the organization when religious beliefs are not given the importance it deserves, or when one religious group is shown more favor than another. This can lead to anger and a sense of being victimized. An example of cases like that where being given time off during the week to attend religious responsibilities, right? And sometimes what you find happening in the workplace is that there are inconsistencies there, and those inconsistencies can lead to conflict in the workplace. Organizations often experience generational conflict due to differences in experience and education levels. Again, this is an age-old issue for conflict in organizations. Unfortunately, what you tend to find, now I'm not sure if this situation is as obvious now as it used to be, say, 30, 40 years ago, but oftentimes what you would have found is that you would find that long-serving employees in an organization did not possess the educational levels that the younger persons coming in would possess. However, they had the experience that the younger persons did not have. So each one from their particular vantage point often felt they were in a place of superiority and not deferring to the skills or the experience of the other in order to work together for the good of the company or good of the organization. So that often led to conflict as well. Ethnic differences in organizations can also lead to jealousy, lack of respect, denigration between employees, thus widening the conflict between them in the company. So this is a particular problem now in multi-ethnic societies, like ours, for example. And what you find happening is, especially when tensions for different reasons may occur and conflict may occur, there may be truthful and reliable evidence of these ethnic differences occurring, or should I say ethnic conflicts occurring. Sometimes it may be real, sometimes it may be imagined, but either way it's happening. And this can lead to conditions within the organizations that defeat the purpose of moving forward and progressing towards your goal, the company's goal. So the end result of all of the above is that all internal conflicts reduces the chance of successful achievement of the organizational goals. Now we want to look at structural interventions in managing those conflicts. So what can we do within the organization to help manage some of these conflicts? We can change the structure. What do we mean by this? If the conflict is at an intergroup level, such as between two departments, a structural solution could be to have the two departments, such as the heads of those departments, report to the same senior executive, one person higher than them. And this person now could then align the goals of each department that might be incompatible with each other. It can be aligned to the company's goals now, bringing some sense of standardization and uniformity between them, thus forcing them to work together for one common goal instead of in isolation or separate and apart and independent from each other. So this is one possible solution. Another, we can change the composition of the team. So if the conflict is between team members, persons or individuals within one team, the easiest solution may be to change the composition of the team, separating the personalities that were at odds. Now, when this is not possible, because everyone is needed due to the skill or expertise that they possess, so sometimes you really can't because you need those individuals because of their skill. What you can do is arrange to have a less confrontational work setting. So the physical workspace now, you're looking at trying to design it in such a way that you provide less opportunity for them to encounter each other. So imagine a group cubicle setup where you can have the individual members of the team, you can have them set up along the walls of the cubicle. So their desks would be set up in such a way where they would actually be facing the walls and their backs would be to each other. So they're not in each other's face all the time. So that may reduce the risk of confrontation. Additionally, Other interventions may include a common opposing force. So this may involve focusing on the enemy, such as your competition, right? So you're transferring the focus away from each other to your enemy or your competition. So by focusing attention on a competitor company, the groups may decide to work together to enhance the organizational effectiveness for the company as a whole. So you're shifting your focus. Additionally, you can use a majority rule approach where team members can take a vote. And the idea is that with most votes is the one that gets, that idea will get implemented, that has the most votes. So the majority rule approach can work if participants feel that the procedure is fair. However, it's important to note that this approach should be used sparingly and should only happen after you have healthy discussion of the issues. So you're not using the vote to avoid that discussion, okay? The vote should come after, and you should have support that the procedure is fair. Additionally, another approach to solving the conflict could be approach to solving the problem itself. So in the problem solving mode, the individuals or groups that are party to the conflict are asked to focus on the problem and not each other. So in other words, don't personalize it. Focus on the problem in order to uncover the root cause of the problem. If you can uncover the root cause of the problem, you can now look towards a solution. So this approach recognizes that the rarity of one side being completely right and the other side being completely wrong. So when you take this approach of problem solving and you focus on the problem and you have the opportunity to discuss and communicate with each other in a safe, productive manner, oftentimes you would find that there is some truth in everybody's side and there is some wrong in every side. And that you will never come to that realization or understanding unless you're able to talk and discuss. Now let's look briefly at alternative dispute resolution, ADR. Now, if any of you have done ENVS 460 already, this should just be review for you. We look at this aspect of the topic just briefly for this course, since it's covered in more detail in 460. So ADR, what is it? This is a method of resolving disputes between parties, both as an alternative to litigation and even after litigation has commenced. So this is a definition that was retrieved and extracted from trinidadlaw.com. So this is a voluntary, ADR is a voluntary method with the aid of an independent third party in most instances to assist the party in their deliberation. The aim of the ADR process, very important to note here, this third point, the aim of the ADR process is to arrive at a mutually acceptable resolution, which is cost effective, quick, and commercially beneficial to any organization involved. So let us look at a few types of ADR, particularly as will be relevant in environmental problems. The first, negotiation. So negotiation is a process whereby the parties involved and their legal advisors, so each party will have a legal advisor, they seek to resolve the dispute by reaching an agreement either through written correspondence or a meeting between all concerned. So they seek an agreement. Notice we essentially have just the parties here. They may have legal advisors, but there's no intermediate person involved, right? So amongst themselves, they are seeking to have some kind of agreement. Any statements made by either party seeking to settle the dispute cannot be later submitted to court so as to be used against another party in determining the dispute. Right, so let's repeat that. Any statements made by either side during this negotiation process to settle the dispute cannot be later submitted to court so as to be used against the other party in determining the dispute. All right, so it cannot be used as legal evidence. Negotiation and settlement tends to be more cost effective than court proceedings or protracted dispute. In other words, unpleasant, long-lasting court cases, all right, or disputes. They're more effective because anytime you get into litigation and court is going to be very costly and it could be very long-lasting as well. Additionally, another type of ADR, mediation. So this now involves an independent party who is appointed by both parties, and this person acts as a facilitator between them. So now we have the intervention or the involvement of an independent party. This person, this process, focuses on the interests of the two parties or however many parties, their interests. What the mediator does is the mediator imposes no decision. So they are not making a decision, but what they do is they act merely as a facilitator. They facilitate the communication, they facilitate the negotiation and problem solving, etc. But they do not make a decision. This allows the parties to explore a vast range of potential creative solutions which meet with their respective interests. Another type of ADR is arbitration. So this type of ADR, it gives parties the benefit of resolving their matters in private. The process is confidential as opposed to going to court, right? So when you're in court, it's no longer a private setting. The issue is decided by a person with specialized knowledge relevant to the issue, particular issue in dispute, whether it be legal or technical in nature. So you have a third party involved here, but in this particular case, unlike mediation that we just discussed, this third party actually decides the issue, all right? And they are equipped to decide the issue because they have specialized knowledge relevant to the issue. However, in this type of ADR, there are a host of international rules that parties can rely upon in order to govern the arbitral process. So it's not done randomly. There are international rules and standards to guide the process. Now let's look briefly at the challenges associated with litigation. Remember, we just looked at ADR, and the ADR options are options that you would want to consider before going to litigation, or in other words, before going to court. So litigation reduces the predictability in decision making. In other words, the parties don't really have too much of a say in terms of what the final outcome would be. It is determined by the judge or jury, right? So the outcome of a dispute in the hands of a third party, such as a judge, jury, or arbiter, and decisions are binding. So they are now legally binding once they are decided in the courts. Litigation places your fate in the hands of persons less familiar with your problems than you are. So here's another disadvantage. So while judges may be knowledgeable in the field of general law, he or she will have no experience in your particular case. So if the case involves issues that really are, let us say, scientific or environmental in nature, litigation in the courts of law can now be a challenge for you because you don't know how that judge is going to interpret it. You don't know that person's level of knowledge and understanding of the issue. Litigation impedes efficient problem solving. So any system that requires a hearing before a judge in order to make a decision, is worse than a committee system. In other words, it takes long. So where a committee can convene on short notice, you're not going to find that in courts. And if you have a court system that is inefficient, you have even greater problems. Litigation is extremely expensive. Litigation requires the involvement of lawyers who charge for their services, and there is no natural limit to the cost of litigation. In other words, the lawyers, they can charge you whatever they feel is fair. If, depending on the particular case that they have taken to represent you, they decide their fees are worth your lifetime savings, your house and land, these are the risks that you present yourself in. Okay, lawsuits also tend to move very slowly toward an unpredictable solution, as we already said, and the likely result is that you lose control of the cost towards the solution the longer it takes. So not only the fact that you lawyers, they can charge whatever they feel is fair, but the longer the process in the courts of law, which is likely to be long, is the greater the cost to you. Litigation also destroys relationships. Litigation destroys the relationship between the plaintiff and the defendant, the two parties. Plaintiff, the one complaining, the defendant, the one that is being accused. It may also require a considerable effort to collect and enforce a judgment, which increases the intensity of the hostility. So, for example, think of a situation where a judgment requires the winner of the case to repossess some kind of asset from the defendant. This is why oftentimes you have those kinds of situations where police will have to get involved, because the level of hostility in those kinds of situations at the moment when the repossession of the asset has to take place, it can be very intense, very hostile, at times even violent. Those companies that are known to handle problems in a fair manner, they do better over time than those who are litigious and hostile. So basically what we are saying is litigation should be avoided except when there are no options. All right. So you always, as long as you see the opportunity for negotiation, mediation, whatever the case may be, you always want to go first for that. If there is the opportunity for that. Of course, every situation might be different. So in summary, what are we saying? Organizational conflict is counterproductive to achieving environmental goals. Managing these internal conflicts is critical for the success of any organization. This becomes even more so with the increasing risks to our environment. If we are not careful, our personal and group priorities can become in conflict with nature itself. So this week's lesson activity, as we usually do, I ask you to refer to Unit 3 resources for additional reading and information. Much of what was covered in today's lecture would be available there in some detail for you to review. Additionally, the activity, Unit 3, Individual Assignment 1, this will be a marked assignment with 5 marks, 5% of your final grade. So you are asked to take this assignment very seriously. For this assignment, each student will research and prepare an essay response to a question posed. A rubric will be provided for you. Please review and follow the rubric guidelines in order to get the best possible mark that you can. And this essay topic will be based on modern communication technologies and a specified challenge to that communication. So I want to thank you for joining me for today's lesson. Please refer to eClassroom for the activity for this week. Thank you.